All right, it's been a couple weeks, so good to see you guys. So we're continuing in the beginning of Avodah Zarah on Daf Hey. I think this is going to be a good one, or an interesting one. I enjoyed learning it myself. So we're going to start off with a statement that comes up actually a few times in Shas, not just in Avodah Zarah, but also in Nedarim and a couple other places, which discusses categories of people who are considered like dead. In other words, they're not dead, but they're as though they were dead. And then we'll see how the Gemara uses that to explain something in the Psukim which doesn't quite add up. Actually, a few examples. And then how the Mefarshim try to understand, in I think pretty brilliant way in some cases, why the Gemara concludes the way it does in terms of which category of person is being discussed. And as we go, that'll make more sense as we go on. So let's start by learning the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. So it teaches as follows: Arbaa Chashuבים Kemeitim. There's four groups of people that are considered dead, not literally dead, of course, but in terms of the fact that they have no life. Ve'eluhen ani suma u'mitzora u'mi she'en lo banim. So someone who's poor, right? Poor here means very, very poor, to the point where it's as though they're dead. Someone who's blind, a leper, mitzora, and someone who has no children. So it asks, how do we know each of these cases? So ani, a poor person, dichtiv ki metu kol anashim u'ma ninhu datan v'aviram u'mi metu mehave havu ela shiadu menichsehan. So this is the case that we're going to be discussing at length. But what's being discussed here is that if we remember when Moshe Rabbeinu, when we're told the story of his childhood, so he kills an Egyptian who's striking a Jew. Then the next day he sees two Jews fighting, and he tries to break them up, and they say, "Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe gets afraid and runs away to Midian. After he has the whole vision at the burning bush, eventually God tells him, "Okay, now you can go back to Egypt. All the people who wanted you dead for having killed the Egyptian taskmaster, they've all died. So you don't have to be afraid of going back to Egypt now and fulfilling the mission of delivering Bnei Israel." So the question is, don't we know, of course, that the two Jews who were fighting were Datan and Aviram? We'll discuss shortly how we know that. So if the two Jews that were fighting with that Moshe broke up were Datan and Aviram, and they were the ones who wanted him dead, so why is God telling Moshe that all the people who wanted him dead have died? We know Datan and Aviram are still alive because they make an appearance at Korach's rebellion later on in Chumash. So if Datan and Aviram are alive when Korach rebels, which is after Yetziat Mitzrayim, so for sure they're alive before Yetziat Mitzrayim even begins. So why is God telling Moshe that they're dead? So the Gemara understands from here, Ela shiadu menichsehem. It's not that they were literally dead, but rather that they were poor, right? That they lost all of their money. In between, when Moshe broke them up for fighting with each other, and when Moshe goes back to do Yetziat Mitzrayim, or to deliver Bnei Israel, so in between that period, Datan and Aviram lost all their wealth, and so they were chashuvin kemet. They were considered as though they were dead, which is why God said, "Okay, now you can go back." Now we'll discuss this at length shortly. The Gemara continues and asks, what about the other category? So Suma, a blind person is considered as dead. How do we know this? Tichtiv, Mamchashakim, Hoshivani, Kimte Olam. Okay, this pasuk that says that I'm in the darkness and you've had me. I'm in the darkness like those who are eternally dead. So the idea is here that someone who dwells in darkness is like those who are dead forever. Mitzora, how do I know a leper? Tichtiv, Al Ma'tehi Kemet. So when this last week's parsha and yesterday's parsha, so when Miriam gets tzarat, Moshe prays on her behalf, and he prays to God and says, "Please don't let her be like a dead person." So we see pretty clearly that a mitzvah is considered like a dead person, right? They're quarantined, they're removed, they're sickly, so they're as though they're dead. U'mi she'en lo banim. How do we know that someone has no children? D'chtiv. When Rachel is complaining to Yaakov about being without child, barren, she says, "Hava li banim v'im'ayin meta anochi." So she says to Yaakov, right, in desperation, "Give me children, and if not, I will die." Right, so pshat there is not that she is the pshat there is that she's just so anguished about the fact that she can't have any children. She says, "Right, I can't take it anymore. So if I don't have any children, I'm going to die. I can't handle it." But the Gemara here understands it to mean that someone who has no children is considered as though they're dead, perhaps in the sense of you're only really alive if you have children to carry on your legacy, carry on your name, etc. Okay, so that's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah.
What do we mean in all of these case is as good as that.
So, right, it doesn't mean literally or even halachically. It just means in the sense that these people don't really have a life in the sense that we understand life. In other words, their life is so empty that it's as though they're not living at all. Right? That a person who is a leper, their life is lifeless. So it's as though they're dead. I think that's the idea. That these are groups of people whose life is almost meaningless because of the circumstances that they're in. That's how I understand it. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Maybe. Okay, so we said earlier that we know that the two Jews who were fighting in Egypt, that Moshe comes to break up the fight, were Datan and Aviram. It just says Shnei Ivrim Nitzim. It just says two Jews that were fighting. So how do we know they were Datan and Aviram? So there's Gemara in the Dharma, Daf Samach Dal Amud Bet. It says as follows: Amar B'Yochanan Mishum Mishum Ben Yochai, Kol Makom Shneimar Nitzim v'Nitzavin, Einan Ela Datan v'Aviram. Wherever the words Nitzim, which means clashing, or Nitzavim, which means standing to kind of greet somebody, appear without it being explained who is doing the fighting or the standing, the reference is to Datan and Aviram. So how do we know this? So the Eitz Yosef there in the Dharma explains. He says as follows. Actually, I'll read it outside because it's simpler that way. And basically, Datan and Aviram, they come up in a couple of places. So the main place they come up is in the story of Korach, which is in Bamidbar Perek Tet Zayin, and towards the end of that story, we're told right before they die. So it says that Datan ve'Aviram in Pasuk Chav Zayin, ve'Datan ve'Aviram yatzu nitzavim petach olehem u'neshehem uvnehem v'tapam. So right before the earth opens up and swallows Datan and Aviram and their families, so it says that they came out from their tents, nitzavim, and they were standing there, kind of to see what would happen. So here we have Datan and Aviram being referred to as being nitzavim. And then also in Dvarim, in, I think, Perek Hey, or not Perek Hey, one second, not Perek Hey, is it this Perek? Here we go, Perek Yud Aleph, excuse me. So Moshe is recapping all the events that happened, and Moshe says, oh, Hashem is so great, etc., etc., you should love him, because, among other things, what he did, V'asher asal Datan v'Aviram, b'nei Eliyav ben Reuven, asher patzta haaretz et piyav, v'tiv lahem et batehem et olehem, that God had the earth open up its mouth and swallow them up and their families, in the midst of Yisrael. And there the discussion is yeah, it says B'kerev Kol Yisrael. Okay, excuse me, I jumped the gun a little bit. So here it says that they were amongst the Jews, which will become relevant later on. But let me just find specifically the pasuk where it says Nitzim. Here, I wrote it down here. Sorry for jumping. Okay. It's in Bamidbar Perek Chavav. Excuse me. So, I'm sorry. Datan and Aviram appear in a few times. They appear in Perek Tet Zayin in Bamidbar, which is the story of Korach, and there, as we saw, they're described as being Nitzavim, as standing. In Bamidbar Perek Chavav, Datan and Aviram are described, are also referenced, and there they're described as being Nitzim, in Pasuk Tet. So let's go to Pasuk Tet here, right? So it's Perek Chavav in Bamidbar is going through the lineages. So the lineage of Reuven, it says Reuven's children, he had the sons of Eliyav, Datan v'Aviram, Hu Datan v'Aviram, Kriya Eda, Asher Hitzu al Moshe ve'al Aaron b'Yadav Koach b'Hatzotam al Hashem. So that Datan and Aviram were the ones who were Nitzim. They were Hitzu al Moshe b'Hatzotam al Hashem. They argued or strove against or fought with God, with Moshe and Aaron. So just to recap, because I confused myself, Nitzavim appears in the story of Korach by Datan and Aviram, and Nitzim, or that Shoresh, appears in Perek Chavav, describing the lineage of Reuven. So there we have the root Nitzavim and Nitzim. And then in terms of where they appear earlier, so in Shmot, Perek Bet, when Moshe goes to break up the two Jews that are fighting, so they're described, right, as being Nitzim. So we have two Jews who are Nitzim, and Datan and Aviram in Bamidbar Perek Chavav are described as two Jews who were Nitzim. And here they're nitzim against each other, but also against Moshe, and also in Bamidbar Chavav, they're nitzim against Moshe. So the Medrash in the Nedarim says that's the same nitzim, that's the same nitzim. And what about nitzavim? So actually, when Moshe first initially tries to go tell Paro to let the Jews go, Paro refuses and makes the workload even harsher. And then we're told after that happens, there's a story where Vayifguot Moshe v'Aaron nitzavim nikratam b'tzitam et Paro. That there are these people who are standing to greet Moshe and Aaron as they leave Paro's palace. And these people come and they say, oh, God should judge you for making things harder, for ruining everything. And Moshe himself actually loses heart. We're not told explicitly who these people who were nitzavim to greet Moshe and Aaron when they left Paro after their failed attempt to deliver Bnei Israel. And so the Medrash says, here we have an example of nitzavim that's nameless, but it's people who are coming against Moshe and Aaron. And in Perek Bet, we have an example of people who are nitzim against Moshe. And in Bamidbar, we have a nitzavim and nitzim where it's named Datan and Aviram. So match the nitzavim that's unnamed to the nitzavim that's named. Match the nitzim that's unnamed to the nitzim that's named. Long story short, at the end of the day, that's what is all encapsulated in this Eitz Yosef here, in his description or explanation of this Gemara in Nedarim, where it says, anytime it says nitzim and nitzavim, it's a reference to Datan and Aviram. So we have here a midrashic understanding that the two Jews that are fighting, that Moshe broke up are Datan and Aviram, as well as the people who come to greet Moshe and Aaron right before Yetziat Mitzrayim actually takes off to accuse them of making the work harder and not easier. Good. So that's that. Let's look now at a Gemara in Nedarim and then at Tosfot. So the Gemara in Nedarim Adaf Zayin Amud Bet says as follows: Amar Rabbi Ila Amarav Nidau b'fanav ein matirin lo ela b'fanav. If a person puts somebody else into cherem or nidui, if someone puts someone into a ban in their person when they're there, so then they can only be released from that ban in person. However, nidau shelo b'fanav matirin lo ben sheb'fanav ben shelo b'fanav. But if somebody bans somebody, says that person should be banned, but they're not there, so then that ban can also be released whether the person's there or not. Amar Rav Chanan Amarav, Hashomeh haskarat Hashem mipi chavero tzarich lenadoto v'im lo nidahu hu atzmo yeh b'nidui. Okay, so someone who hears someone else say God's name in vain, who does haskarat Hashem, in other words, they curse in the name of God, or they use God's name, so he has to put him in nidui, because we don't use God's name lightly. And if a person doesn't do that to the person who used God's name, that person himself who didn't do it should be put into nidui. Why? Shekol makom she'askarat Hashem mitzuya, sham aniyut mitzuya, v'aniyut kemita. Shneimar kimitu kol anashim. And the reason for that is every place where we have a mention of God's name, we also find poverty, and poverty is like death. And here too, it brings that source of kimitu kol anashim. In other words, how do we know that poverty is like death? From the story of Datan v'Aviram. And here it ties this idea of poverty being like death to the concept of swearing in the name of God, or using God's name in a certain circumstance. So at the end of the shir, I'll try to tie this in more clean. I'll mention something which I think is a nice idea about the connection between using God's name and the story of Datan and Aviram. We'll come back to that. But let's look now at Tosfot on this Gemara. Right? Tosfot says, okay, you're telling me that I know from the story of Datan and Aviram that they didn't actually die, but rather they became poor. Tosfot asks a very simple question. He says as follows: Gabei Datan v'Aviram, de'im ken lo metu, az b'Mitzrayim. So if we know Datan and Aviram, we've established that the two Jews who were fighting are Datan and Aviram, and we have our Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which says that, okay, we know that they had to have been alive, but it says that they had died, so they must have gotten poor and lost all their money. Sharei hayu b'midbar, because Datan and Aviram were alive in the desert. So Tosfot says, well, wait a minute. Let's go back to our Gemara in Avodah Zarah for a second. And this is the main question of the shir. Right? We said that there's 4 categories of people considered like dead. We have poor people, we have blind people, we have Mitzrayim, and we have people without children. So we said, how do I know that Datan and Aviram, how do I know that a poor person is like dead? Because Datan and Aviram were alive, but they're called dead, so they must have been poor. Tosfot says, how do I know they weren't blind? How do I know that they weren't Mitzrayim? How do I know that they weren't childless? If I have 4 categories of people who are considered like dead, why do I assume Datan and Aviram were poor as opposed to the other 3 categories and use that as a proof? So Tosfot goes and tries to explain why the other three are not applicable to the case of the Datan Aviram, which by process of elimination means that they must have lost all of their wealth. So how do we know? Okay, so we say Sumin Leika Memar. We know that they couldn't be blind. Datan Aviram. Dichtiv Hainei Anashim Ahem Tinaker. So this is actually really, I think, kind of clever. When the Datan Aviram are fighting with Moshe at the story of Korach, so Moshe calls the Datan Aviram up, right, to discuss, and the Datan Aviram say, "Vayomru lo na'aleh," we won't come up, right? Why not? They accuse Moshe of pulling the wool over their eyes, over the people's eyes, right? You brought us out from land of milk and honey. They're referring to Egypt, right? You brought us out from land of milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, and now you're promising us all these things, right? And you're just trying to rule over us, and you're tricking us, and you're lying to us and to the people, right? So you're not bringing us to a land of milk and honey, right? You brought us from a land of milk and honey, and then Datan Aviram say, "Are you going to put out or stab out the eyes of these people? We will not go up." Which is a euphemism for themselves, right? Are you going to try to stab at our eyes? So there, the Datan Aviram are using the phrase metaphorically. They're saying, are you trying to blind us, right? With all of your lies, Moshe, right? We're not going to fall for your lies. That's what they say. But here Tosfot says, but how could the Datan Aviram have said to Moshe, you're trying to blind us, but it won't work, if they were already blind? So Tosfot says, learn from here that they couldn't have been blind. Because if they'd been blind, they couldn't have said to Moshe, how could you try to blind us? Okay, again, the Datan Aviram are using it metaphorically there, but Tosfot sees from that a proof that they couldn't have been blind. So we've eliminated that option. U'mitzoraim nami lo. Right, and Tosfot says they also couldn't have been lepers. Why not? She'arei hayu b'kerev Yisrael. Because they were in the midst of Yisrael. So if you remember in Devarim, we saw that the Datan Aviram were described as being b'kerev kol Yisrael. They were amongst the people. They were part of Shevet Ruvain. And Mitzorah gets kicked out. So if they were within the Kal Yisrael, so they couldn't have been Mitzorim. Tosfos then says,
Is that a bit shaky because you're talking about years afterwards, right? And how long do you remain a Mitzorah for?
Amazing. Good. We'll actually address that right after we finish this Tosfos. Good question. Very good. So, right? We can't say that, maybe Datan Aviram had Sarat when they were fighting and when Moshe was in Egypt, but then they were healed at Matan Torah, because we have Midrash that say at Matan Torah all the Jews were healed from all of their illnesses. So maybe Datan Aviram had Sarat at Yetziat Mitzrayim, but then they were healed at Matan Torah, which is why in Devarim they're described as being B'kerev Kol Yisrael. So Tosfot says you can't say that. Because the same medrash which teaches me that the Jews were all healed from their illnesses at Matan Torah also says that once the Jews sinned at Chet HaEgel, all the illnesses that they had been healed from came back. So then that doesn't work. But to Johnny's question's a good one. We're going to actually address it in a minute. Tosfot's answer here by Mitzorah is kind of shaky. But let's continue for now, and we'll see. Tosfot says, and Tosfot says, and we can't say that that the reason they were considered as dead is because they didn't have children, right? The Haktiv, because we're told that at Korach's rebellion they came out of their tents, Nitzavim, with their wives and children, right? So they had children. Right? And Tosfot says, perhaps the reason he gives another answer here is because he knows that first answer isn't so good. Why not? Because it's possible that Datan Aviram had children by the time it came to the Korach's rebellion, but they didn't have children perhaps a few years before when Moshe was told to go back to Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the answer that he gives, which is a bit better, is why would the fact that they didn't have children make them any less credible of a threat to Moshe? In other words, okay, I can understand if Datan and Aviram, they became blind or they became leprous, perhaps that's why, and they're considered as dead, so that's why the threat of their testimony to Paro or whatever has passed, and therefore Moshe can come back to Egypt. But if it was that they didn't have any children, so what? Why would that mean that there's any reason for suddenly Hashem to tell Moshe, okay, it's safe to come back to Mitzrayim? And I think this similar idea, but perhaps a stronger way of putting this is when God says to Moshe, Ki metu kol anashim mevakshim et nafshecha, that they've died. So I can understand, okay, the Datan Aviram had sight and they went blind. They had money and they lost their money. They were healthy and then they became Mitzoraim. But how could they have got, if they didn't have children before and now they don't have children, so what happened? Nothing changed, right? No, it's not as though you can become someone without children. You don't have children. So saying that they died from not having children doesn't make sense because there's no change in their status. Tosafot doesn't say this explicitly, but I think that's another way to understand why this is not a viable option for understanding how Datan Aviram died. Okay, so through process of elimination, we say aval b'shvil aniyut v'adayin nimnu miliyot krovim l'malchut. Right? Rather, it must be because they became poor, and so therefore they were discarded as having any sort of meaningful say, and Moshe was able to come back to Egypt. The Ran actually says pretty much something identical in his comments about answering each of these options. So we won't look at that right now. Let's answer actually what Johnny's question was. I think the answer given by the Chidushei Gaonim is really quite clever. So there's a Mishnah in Masechet Negaim, in Perek Zayin, Mishnah Aleph, which opens and says, Elu be'alrot teorot. It describes categories of tzarat which are tahor, right, which don't impurify a person. So the classic example of that is actually said explicitly in the Torah. If someone has tzaras on their entire body, they're white in their entire body, so then they're actually paradoxically tahor. Right? If they have tzaras on 99% of their body, they're tameh, or 1% of their body, they're tameh, but if it's 100%, then they're tahor. So that's one example given in this Mishnah. And another example given in this Mishnah is anyone who had tzarat before Matan Torah. So Rabbi Avodah Bartanur on the Mishnah describes, Mishai tabo tzarat kodem Matan Torah. Why is that pure? Why isn't that tzarat mitameh? Lo haya tameh mechamat oto negal achar Matan Torah. So someone who had tzaras before Matan Torah isn't impure after Matan Torah, even though they have tzaras. Tichtiv, because the pasuk describing tzarat says, Adam ki yeh be'or b'saro, seit asapach do b'heret. A person who will have on his skin some form of tzarat. Prat lazeh shekvar haya. So here there's a drasha which says, anyone, right, ad Matan Torah, the command was given for all time going forward, but it said anyone who will have tzarat. So that excludes anyone who had before Matan Torah. That therefore anyone who had tzarat before Matan Torah, even if it continues through after Matan Torah, that tzarat is not mitameh. And that's according to this Mishnah. So the Chidushei Gaonim uses that actually to explain quite brilliantly what we've been saying here. So he says as follows, right? So Lekach lo nishtalchu ela vadai d'ilo ayu mitzoraim bezeh ofen me'atahara lo ayu chashuvim kemeitim teha betoch amam hayu yoshvim im ken dun mina umina וגם אם היו מצורעים טמאים בדין תורה, על כל זה בהיותם במצרים, שעדיין לא ניתנה תורה, לא נשתלחו ואינם חשובים כמתים. So what the Chidushei Gaonim says is essentially, how do we know that the Datan Aviram couldn't have been dead because they were mitzoraim? Because we're talking before Matan Torah. So even if the Datan Aviram were mitzoraim, and even if it was a case of tzaras that wasn't like the whole body, but it was tzaras that would normally be mitameh, but this is before Matan Torah. And before Matan Torah, as the Mishnah said, there's no din of tzarat. So therefore, we shouldn't consider them like dead because their tzaras isn't mitameh. And they're not, and because it's not mitameh, they don't get kicked out and they don't have to isolate and do all this stuff. So because it was before Matan Torah, there was no idea of tzaras being mitameh, and so therefore you can't use the Datan Aviram having tzaras to be chashuv and kemet. So I think that's a really clever way of answering up Johnny's question on Tosfot, whose explanation for tzarat is b'shvach, because it says, right, Tosfot says, they couldn't have had tzaras because they're described as being within the camp, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have tzaras back then. So Chidushei Gaonim says, en achinami, even if they had tzaras back then, it wouldn't have made a difference because only tzarat that happens after Matan Torah is tzaras that you can even categorize as being considered as though the person is dead to begin with. So it's not a problem regardless. So that's how the Chidushei Gaonim explains the weakness in Tosfot's answer. Let's see, what does the Rif say here, just very quickly. Okay, yeah, that's not, we actually explained that already. Okay, good. So we have just a few minutes left. I want to come back to something that I said before. There's a medrash that discusses how Moshe kills the Egyptian. Right, we're told that Moshe looks this way and that way. Right, Moshe looks and sees there's nobody who can see, so he strikes the Egyptian taskmaster and buries him in the sand. So the Medrash in Shemot Rabbah asks, how did Moshe strike this Egyptian? So Rabbi Aviatar says, with his fist. In other words, Moshe just beat him until he died. Like Moshe literally murdered this Egyptian. There are those that say, right? They're dealing with all the labor and the bricks to build the monument. So Moshe picked up a brick made of mud, and he smashed in the Egyptian's, he smashed in his skull, and he smashed out his brain. In other words, he used a weapon, right? Rabbi Aviatar says Moshe killed him with his bare hands. The Yesh Omrim say that Moshe killed the Egyptian with a weapon, right? A brick that he found lying on the side there. But the rabbis say, no, Moshe pronounced the Shema Meforash and killed the Egyptian through saying the unpronounceable name of God. Shinemar, how do we know this? Because a few psukim later, when Moshe is arguing with the Tana Aviram say, Hal Hargeni Ata Omer, are you saying that you want to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? So the drasha there is, Hal Hargeni Ata Omer, the Tana Aviram say, are you saying you're going to kill us? So Atam Avakesh Lo Nemar, it doesn't say, are you going to try to kill us? It's saying, are you going to say you're going to kill us? Mikana Talamet Shema Meforash Hiskir Al Mitzvah V'Argo. That from here you learn that Moshe didn't actually kill the Egyptian using his hand or even an instrument, but he spoke his death. He said something, and it caused the Egyptian to die. So what does that mean? He must have said the Shema Meforash. Right? V'kevan sheshama ken. And once Moshe heard that the Tana Aviram knew that, nitareh milashon hara, v'yomar achenu da'adavar, and then he's afraid of what's happening, and he runs away to Midian. But we see here this idea in the Medrash that Moshe didn't actually kill the Egyptian with his hand or with a weapon, but he did it indirectly through the Shem Meforash. So, I want to just conclude by saying, what's motivating this particular Medrash here? I think it's a couple things. Number one is, you're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So, we're talking about the greatest prophet who ever lived, so saying that he, like as Rabbi Aviatar did, like beat a man to death, even though it was before he received his nevuah and his mission, but still, it's cleaner, as it were, to say that he used the Shem Hashem, right? It's not it doesn't tarnish Moshe as much in terms of him having actually murdered somebody. So it removes one level of culpability from Moshe in the death of this Egyptian. And also, it shows that it was divinely approved, right? If he said this unpronounceable name, it means that God really killed the Egyptian. And so Moshe was acting properly, as opposed to what Rabbi Aviatar say, or the Eshomim say, where Moshe killed the Egyptian. So, again, it's obvious that God approved of it in some sense because Moshe is then chosen to lead Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, but that particular act, the Psukim are kind of silent on what God's opinion is. So here you bring God into it and say, no, Moshe actually acted properly. So I think that's one way of what's motivating that particular story. But we can tie it back to the Gemara that we saw in Nedarim here, I think in a beautiful way, where if you remember what it said in Nedarim is, Kol makom she'azkarat Hashem mitzuya, sham aniyut mitzuya v'aniyut kemita. Wherever you have the saying of the God's name, wherever that occurs, because it's such a serious and severe thing to use the unpronounceable name, so you find poverty, and poverty is like death. What is the proof of this? The proof that's used here is kimetu kol anashim. Right? So it's actually perfect, because if we say that Moshe killed the Egyptian through saying God's name, that's how the Egyptian died, and then the Tana Aviram say to Moshe, oh, halageni ata omer, you're going to kill us through saying God's name the way you killed the Egyptian. So here we have this idea of Haskarat Hashem Mitzuya, this idea of the name being pronounced is found in this scenario of Moshe with the Tana Aviram, and then we find Kimetu Kol Anashim, that the people who died, they didn't actually die, but the Tana Aviram became poor, and they died. So this is a fulfillment of that idea. Wherever the Haskarat Hashem is found, Sham Aniyut Mitzuya, because the Tana Aviram become poor and lose all their wealth. After they say to Moshe, Halageni ata omer, eventually they become poor, and the poverty is like death. So this Gemara Nedarim ties nicely to this Medrash in Shemot Rabbah. Again, this is a connection I'm making. It doesn't say it explicitly, but I think it makes a lot of sense to say, according to the Rabbanan, that Moshe killed the Egyptian by saying Shem Hashem. So the Gemara Nedarim says, wherever you have the Shem Hashem, so it leads to poverty, it leads to death. So that, of course, ties to our Gemara back in Avodah Zarah, which says that the Tam Aviram didn't actually die, but they were poor and it was like they were dead, because that was where the Shem Hashem was being discussed. So it ties the threads nicely between the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, the Gemara in Nedarim, and then the Medrash in Shemot Rabbah, about the severity of Shem Hashem, but more importantly about this idea that Aniyut Kemita. Just to close, a couple of quick other examples of where this concept of poverty being like death come up, and how it's used to explain psukim that don't quite add up. So one is brought by the Maharsha, where the Maharsha says, "Ke'adam arishon shechatav v'nigzar alav midat aniyut dichtiv arua adama v'avorecha v'achalta et esav hasadeh b'seat apecha v'chulei." That, right, we're told God commands Adam Arishon and says to him, if you eat from the Eitz Hadat, you'll die. Right? And we don't find that Adam dies after he eats from the Eitz Hadat. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the classical understanding of that is that it just means that Adam would have been immortal, and once he ate from the Eitz Hadat, it means that he would die at some point. Eventually, that death would happen, that he would become mortal. That was really what God meant when he said that you will die. But another way to understand it is what the Maharsha says here, which is that if we say Aniyut Kamita, that someone is considered as though they were dead if they become poor, so Adam Arishon, he had all the food in the world, he didn't have to work at all, and then his punishment that he received was B'zeat Apecha Tuchalech, that he'd have to work, and things wouldn't come to him on a silver platter. So it's as though he became poor as a punishment for eating from the tree, and that poverty is like death. So it actually was a fulfillment of Hashem's warning of saying, if you eat from the tree, you will die, meaning you'll become poor, because you will be cursed with having to work the land in order to get food and sustenance. And then one final example of this idea of Aniyut Kamita. This is actually, I was speaking to my father-in-law today, and he told me about this medrash. So it's brought by Rashi in the story of Yaakov when he runs away to Haran and he meets Rachel. So he comes empty-handed to Rachel. So the medrash that Rashi quotes says, "Lefi sheba b'yadayim rekaniyot," that Yaakov came empty-handed. That's why he was crying when he met Rachel. He kissed Rachel and he cried. Why is he crying? Because he came empty-handed. Amar Eliezer Eved Avi Abba Ayu biyadav nezamim tzmidim umig danot ve'ani en biyadi klum. That Yaakov is lamenting and saying, my grandfather's servant Eliezer, when he came to Haran to find a wife for Yitzchak, so he came with all this stuff, with these camels, with the gold and the nose rings and the bracelets, etc. And Yaakov said, I come with nothing. Why did he have nothing? Right? Didn't Yitzchak send Yaakov to Haran? So why does Yaakov not have any money? Surely Yitzchak would have sent him with something. So the Medrash says, "Lefi sheradaf Elifaz ben Esav b'mitzvat aviv acharav lehargo v'sigo," that when Yaakov ran away to Haran, so Esav sent his eldest son Elifaz to go kill him. Because if you remember, after Yaakov stole the bracha from Esav said, "I'm going to kill Yaakov." So we don't hear of Esav trying to kill Yaakov. So the Medrash says, yeah, he sent his eldest son Elifaz to go chase him after Haran and kill him. Elifaz catches up to Yaakov. Lefi shegadal Elifaz b'cheiko shel Yitzchak. But since Eliphaz grew up in Yitzchak's house, Mashach Yadav, he didn't want to kill Yaakov, right? But he was caught. On the one hand, he didn't want to kill Yaakov. On the other hand, he had to fulfill his father's command, right? Esav's command. So Amar Lo, so Eliphaz says to Yaakov, Ma'aseh litzivu shel Abba, I'm supposed to kill you. So what should I do? I don't want to kill you, but how do I fulfill my father's command? So Amar Lo Yaakov says to Eliphaz, Tol ma shebiyadi, Ve'ani chashuv kemet. So Yaakov says, don't kill me, take everything I have. And since a poor person with nothing is considered like dead, you will have technically fulfilled your father's command. In other words, Yitzchak really did send Yaakov with stuff to Haran, but on the way Eliphaz came and in order to fulfill Esav's command, Yaakov gave everything to Eliphaz. So that explains why the Psukim don't tell us about Esav actually trying to kill Yaakov. In fact, he did. But it also explains why Yaakov arrived to Haran with nothing, because Eliphaz came and took it all. But what we see here is this idea again of Hani Chashuv Kemet, that a person who has no wealth at all is considered like dead. And since this person is considered like dead, so that's how Eliphaz could have technically gone back to Esav and said, I fulfilled your command. And that explains why Yaakov arrived in Haran and was crying when he fell in love with Rachel, because he had nothing on his person to offer her. That's it. Shkoyach. All right, shkoyach.